My name is Karen Hill. I'm in Winnipeg at the School of Social Work. Today is January the 26th, 1984, and I'm interviewing Mrs. Helen Riesberry, who's had long experience with children's aid societies in Manitoba. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project through the Canadian Association of Social Workers. To begin with, Mrs. Riesberry, I wonder if you might tell us where you were born and a little bit about your early life.
Well, I was born in the rural municipality of Whitehead. That abuts onto the city of Brandon on the western end. And so I was born about 9 miles west of the city of Brandon on a farm, in a farm home, and spent the first 4 years of my life there, at which time our family moved into Brandon, and so my education was within the Brandon school system. And after finishing high school, I took a business course, which was a stenography course plus accounting. And I worked at many things. That I came out of that course in the 30s. That's why I wasn't able to go on to university at that point. It was just not possible. And so I did many things, all of which turned out to be very helpful later on. You know, I did things such as typing letters for 10 cents a letter, candling eggs at Swift Canadian, working a switchboard at the Hospital for Mental Diseases, many things that I would never have seen as what I wanted to do, but that's what there was available to do. And then I was able to work as a junior teacher at the business college where I took my course, working with the students who were having particular difficulties. That was very interesting. And then I worked for the provincial government and the federal government as a stenographer or helping to run the occupational department at the Hospital for Mental Diseases. That's what it was called in those days. Now, of course, it's the Mental Health Center. And then I married in 1942 to a most wonderful person, but our time together was short because that was war years. And he went overseas, was an officer in the services, and he was killed overseas. And we were fortunate to have one beautiful daughter that he never saw because he went overseas a few weeks before she was born. And so when he was killed overseas in 1944, that of course, you know, my whole life was, well, it meant complete change because of course we had looked forward, as most young couples did in those days, to having, well, I'd always wanted 4 children. From the time I was the smallest girl, looking after babies had been, you know, one of the things that we did after school. You'd go and take the neighbor's children out in a carriage, and that doesn't happen so much these days. And so for me, it was a very dramatic time, and I decided, well, I really needed to do something with my life now, and what would it be? Social work was accidental. I was looking for something that I could do on a part-time basis because my daughter was very young at that time, and we were living with my parents, and so somebody said, you know, the Children's Aid Society is looking for someone to do work with the dependents of people in the armed forces. Why don't you apply? After all, you've got lots of experience, you know what it's like to be a dependent, you've been across Canada. And so I went down and interviewed and met that wonderful person, Sid McCartan, whom you've probably heard of. And we had a very interesting discussion, and he hired me right there to come to work the next week. And this was, these terms will probably be unfamiliar to you, but we were doing what they called DBTS and DSOs. And that was...
Did you see what those are?
Well, that was with respect to dependents, you see, who were in financial need and needed extra funding, or if there was compassionate leave, that type of thing, if a person needed to be able to get home or to have a different posting because of compassionate reasons. And so you would go out and interview the people. And I could do it you know, in the times when my daughter was asleep, primarily after lunch, she always had a good long rest. So I would go out and do a couple of interviews. In the evening after she'd gone to bed, I'd go out and do a couple. And I would go into the office once or twice a week and report to Sid McCartan. And that's how I started. And so I'd been there just a matter of months when he said, you know, you've got to do something about getting some training, because he sort of said, you're a natural. So I said, I can't. You know, that's, I can't. I've got a young child. You can if you really want to. So I thought about it, and we worked together on it, and the federal government was offering a 4-month course that summer here at the School of Social Work. And Helen Mann, who's going to be one of the people I believe you're interviewing, was very largely responsible for that course. And so I came. It was 4 months long. It was marvelous. It was a tremendous experience, and I went back to the agency, continuing to work part-time, and taking courses at the university to get all my social science requirements in psychology and sociology, etc.
And were you taking those courses here at the University of Manitoba?
Oh no, Brandon College.
Brandon College.
Brandon College, yes. And so then, in '47, I was accepted into the School of Social Work here as a special student, because I didn't have a full undergraduate degree, but my years of experience and I guess my maturity, I was a little older than the average student naturally, and so I came into the school, and it was a wonderful year. Yes. That was when we went from September through to the next July, because of course there was a 3-month block placement at the end of the academic year.
What kind of courses did you take when you were here during that year?
Very similar to what you have now. Of course, all the history of social development, social casework, group work, field work placements throughout the training period. We look back on it and think that it was particularly good in those years. You know, the school was relatively new. I think the first class graduated from Manitoba in '45. That was the year that I started with the Children's Aid Society, March 1945. And it was a very good school, excellent staff. C.A. White-Smith was the director. I don't know whether that's a name you've come across at all. I think he is not alive. He was in Saskatoon for a good number of years, but I don't think he is still alive.
And were there other faculty that you worked particularly closely with when you were here?
Well, there was Marjorie Robbins. There was, there was a considerable, you know, quite a large faculty. But the people who stand out are Dr. Smith and Helen Mann, Marjorie Robbins. Some of the names are, you know, they've gone a little.
I wonder if I might ask you a question that's perhaps a little personal, but as a single parent myself, I wonder what it was like for you as a single parent when you went to your year-long course here.
It was difficult, but I was very fortunate because I had a sister. Mind you, she was living way, way out in the west end of Winnipeg, far farther out than my daughter lives now. And in those days, you used to walk 3/4 of a mile up to Portage Avenue. Then you caught a rickety old bus that ran once every half hour, and you took that to the end of the car line, which was around Deer Lodge Hospital, and you got on a streetcar. And that took you down to the next point by the Hudson's Bay, and then you caught a bus. And you finally, after 2 hours, got to the university for an 8 o'clock class. I used to leave about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
And you know what children are like, if you've been a single parent. Many a morning, my daughter would be sobbing as I left, you know. My sister would always tell me, you weren't out the gate before she was fine. But you don't know that, you know, and so you're anxious naturally about her during the day.
What was it that gave you that incentive to move from Brandon to Winnipeg and make such a big change?
Well, Sid McCartan was a fairly strong stimulant, you know, because he felt that this was, and of course I had found that social work was, I really enjoyed what I was doing, the contacts with the people. It opened a whole new world. To me, it was much more exciting than what I'd been doing in my previous career. And so I wanted to develop it. I could see this as becoming something I wanted to do with my life, something that would be satisfying but exciting, stimulating. And it was. I think I was one of those very fortunate people to have your work career in something that you enjoyed so much.
Indeed. You graduated from, or got your, was it your master's degree in social work?
No, there wasn't such a thing in those days, not here. There wasn't even a bachelor's. It was a diploma. In those days, it was a diploma in social work. And that's what I
And when did you
obtained.
achieve that?
1948.
And you received some special honors as well.
I was
did you
gold
not?
medalist of the class.
So you
And a very unique thing is, I think we're the only family where mother and daughter are both gold medalists from this School of Social Work.
Oh, isn't that marvelous?
Yes.
So your daughter accomplished that as well?
Yes.
That's wonderful, just wonderful. I'm wondering if we can change focus for just a moment. In when you obtained your diploma in social work in 1948, what was social work in Manitoba like at the time?
Well, remember that was still war years. So that in terms of possibilities, in terms of budget, in terms of cars to get out and do service, resources were very limited. So that social work was certainly, it was only very shortly before that that they had their first trained staff person at the CAS of Western Manitoba. But they had some wonderful people because K.O. McKenzie was one of the first trained executive directors, followed by Sid McCartan. Well, you know, that gave that particular agency, I think, a very wonderful grounding. Now, the agency had been there since 1898, but all the work until about, I think the first staff member was hired in 1929. It was all done by the board, by the board members. They went out and investigated the situations. They made arrangements for children.
Certainly a very different situation than what we find now, isn't it?
Oh,
So there were few social workers in Manitoba at the time that you graduated.
well, when I took over the agency in August 1948, we had 5 staff members, 5 social workers, all of whom, we were very fortunate at that time, all of whom were graduates from the Manitoba School of Social Work. And
Who were those colleagues?
Joyce and Ian Sutherland, Maureen Jelly, Alfreda Wareham. Now, that's us. That's the 5 of us. And I'm in touch with them all. Well, no, Joyce has, Joyce died of cancer a number of years ago. But the others I'm still in touch with.
And were there other people who did the work of the agency at that time, as well as you 5?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what you mean. We had some clerical, we had a couple of clerical staff. But
So there were not volunteers weren't doing the work,
Oh,
or untrained
well,
staff.
no, that was, it was still wartime. Volunteers were to come, volunteers always as the board of directors. I sometimes think we forget that your board of directors are really such effective volunteers. I worked all of my years with a private agency, and I can't stress highly enough just how important that volunteer input is. You know, the talents, the abilities that you get, no one person or no staff could bring to an agency the richness that those people bring to an agency.
Yeah, they're really an essential component.
I think so.
Yes.
I think so. To keep you closely related to your community, to keep you alert to changes in your community, because they're part of the community. They're out in it all the time. Occasionally, particularly, now of course I was from that community, and so I knew it better perhaps than many people do who come in from outside. But still, the people who are the business people, the community people, they can share a great deal with you that you might not be able to get.
They might bring a different perspective as well as different information.
Of course.
Because of their different backgrounds.
And skills, tremendous skills.
When you became executive director of the Children's Aid Society of Brandon at that time, is that what it was called?
No, it was
then?
Western Manitoba then.
It was Western Manitoba.
10,000 square miles.
I was hoping you would describe the situation of
Yes.
child welfare in Western Manitoba for us at the time that you began that
Well, the 10,000 square miles went from the Saskatchewan boundary on the west to, well, if you know where Riding Mountain National Park is, Clear Lake, the line went there and then farther north to the north of Russell, Manitoba. That's about 135 miles northwest of Brandon, to the international boundary on the south, and just a short distance east, which was sort of Camp Shiloh, which is about 20 miles east of Brandon. That was before the days of rural electrification. Now, that may be a completely new concept to you. There've always been lights in the country, I'm sure, but I can remember traveling. It was all gravel roads, of course, and you would go out and it would be pitch black. I can remember many times, because in those days when we went out, you know, if we had 2 cars, that's all, to travel the 10,000 square miles, because you couldn't get cars, you know, in the wartime. And we would go out, start out on a Tuesday morning, and maybe come back Friday night. And you'd start out west, and then you'd go up all that western to the north, and across the north to the eastern boundary, and back down in. You'd be absolutely exhausted. And you'd be on gravel roads, you'd be meeting with farm families in the evening. You'd park your car on the highway, for instance, say north of Russell, and the farmer would come with his no fancy snowmobiles in those days. You know, they were the little wooden what would you call it, cabs on the runners, the sleighs, no springs or anything. And he'd meet you at the highway and take you to the farm and bring you back. And I can remember many a time on a cold, cold, frosty night coming back to the highway and wondering if your car would start and going down to the little hotel in Russell, or way out in the West End, Macaulay. I can remember one dark night getting lost because I missed a turn in the road, landed up onto a little wee dirt road, and then finally that road disappeared. And I had to back up 3 miles. And, you know, there were some really quite scary experiences, and because it was pre-rural electrification even, you know, there were only the stars, if there were stars, and it was, and maybe a faint glow of lamps from the windows. Things changed just so dramatically
yes, I'm sure
over the
they
years.
did. When you were doing that kind of work out from the center, out from Brandon, what kind of contact did you and your workers have with each other if a rapid-fire decision had to be made, a troublesome situation came up in a remote area? What happened then?
Well, we had telephone, of course, but as executive director at that time, you see, I carried a district myself right to the Saskatchewan boundary, and if we were short a staff member, then I would just fill in and do a longer route. And we always had staff conference every Monday morning. We always tried to sit down together and to share concerns and to plan our week and to know where people were going to be, so that we did. And of course, with only 5 of us, communication was very close. And we had also, we were all graduates within the last couple of years of Manitoba. We had a common background, we had a common body of knowledge. You know, communication was I think, excellent, and we kept in close touch.
In that 10,000 square mile area, how many clients were you serving? What was the population? Who were they?
Oh, now the population would be, I think it was around 110,000 totally, with the majority of those in the city of Brandon. But of course that was still the time when there were a lot of small family farms. The rural scene has changed a lot, and of course a lot of people moved in after the war, and with the growing urbanization, so many people moved from the rural areas. But in those days, all the small towns were vital and active, and a lot of farm families. So it would be visiting with our basic services were the family protection, unmarried parents, and adoptions. And so you would be going out to interview a family who'd applied to adopt a child. You'd be going out because you'd had a complaint of neglect about a family. You'd be going out, and of course in those days you would realize that unmarried parenthood was something that was not socially acceptable. And so families were very, very anxious that nobody know, and so that you were being very careful as you visited such people and made plans, helped them to plan.
And amongst the population that you served, what was the division between native, white, immigrant, and I can't say indigenous, I can't find the right word, people who were originally from Manitoba?
Well, Western Manitoba was primarily Anglo-Saxon, but the north had a large Ukrainian population, the northern part of our area. At that time, of course, we weren't serving reserves at all. We were the first agency to provide service on Indian reserves, but that wasn't until '62, so that was much later. And so we were not serving Native peoples at that time. It's a shame that we weren't, but that was to come much later.
And was there a division between Roman Catholic, Protestant, or French English services?
In southwestern Manitoba, there, and you know, you think of Russell as being north, but it really isn't. If you look at the map of Manitoba, of course, even Russell is very much in the south. Very few, far more pockets of French-speaking people in the eastern part of the province and in the west. We had a small group of Belgian people down in the southwest part of the area. But otherwise, it was more Ukrainian in the north and Anglo-Saxon. 7 Indian reserves within the territory that we served, but at that time, there was no direct service to them.
Why was that?
Well, it was all provided by, what was provided was provided by the Department of Indian Affairs.
The federal department?
Yes, yes.
Okay. What kinds of needs were you seeing at the time that you became executive director of the agency? What kinds of things were required, and whether they were dealt with or not? Some
of the needs don't change over the years. Human beings being what they are. There are always families for whom the stresses of life are just too much. And so there were, in those days, parents who were not able to provide. Now, tragically, in those days, some of that lack of ability to provide was lack of resources. You know, lack of money, lack of housing, lack of ability to provide the basic food and clothing that were required. And of course, all assistance in those days was municipal. Over the years, the briefs we presented and the presentations we made to government to have a scale, an assistance scale across the province, because some municipalities would give a ton of coal and you know, some potatoes, but there was nothing that guaranteed that if you were in need, you would get a certain amount of funds. And children were taken into care just to see that they had the necessary food and clothing. That seems impossible today, but in the early years that did happen.
At the time that you began your work as executive director, what kind of mandate did the Children's Aid Society have?
Well, we had the mandate to apprehend children. We had the full mandate to provide the child welfare services under the Child Welfare Act of the province of Manitoba, because the whole of the southern part of the province was served by Children's Aid Societies, the western and central and eastern in Winnipeg. And Dauphin, in those days, there was even a Children's Aid Society at Dauphin, but that was closed down later when they didn't have enough community support. And because it was practically all private funds. You know, I can look back to when we were getting, say, $10,000 a year as a grant from the government to provide the services.
Out of what kind of a budget would that have been?
Well, that would be
just
approximately. I think it would, our total budget that first year was probably something like $35,000. When I took over as executive director, I received the salary of $2,700 a year, and that was $300 a year more than the person who preceded me. And I can remember that person saying to me, "Now, don't you come for $2,400. That's not enough," you know. And so that, you know, it's hard for us to realize just how dramatically things have changed sometimes.
Yes, indeed. So under the mandate that the society had at that time, what would happen when how would a child come into care, and what would happen then?
Well, a social worker would apprehend the child, as they do now, would have the right to take a child from their own home and to place that child in foster home. There were lots of foster homes. We were very fortunate in a rural area. Always an urban area tends to have a higher incidence of problems and a lower incidence of resources. And we used to provide foster homes to Winnipeg Children's Aid. For many, many years, we provided them with resources as well as meeting our own needs.
Were there other community resources available besides foster homes?
We had the Maples in the city of Brandon, which was, it was the former home of the first mayor of Brandon, and it is now a museum, by the way, in the city of Brandon called the Daily Museum. But it was our Maples. It was owned and operated by the city of Brandon, but the Children's Aid was the only organization that could admit children to it. So all the children there were placed by us, but the staffing and the maintenance of the building, we did take it over later from the city, but at that time it was operated by the city. So we had the one small group home and otherwise foster homes for placement of children.
And were all children that were apprehended placed either in Maples or in foster homes? Did you have to put any children in other institutions?
Not at that time. That came later when we required specialized institutions. And then they were primarily in Winnipeg. As the years went by, there was Knoll School for Boys and Children's Home of Winnipeg, and, you know, a number of specialized institutions for disturbed children that we couldn't care for in either our own group facilities, because we did develop a lot of group facilities in Brandon too.
Those special children must have been around at that time. What happened to them then?
Well, loving foster parents. You know, there was a nucleus child guidance clinic operating out of the hospital, and we used those facilities. But the social worker and the foster parent and child guidance facility, school, teachers, they were a tremendous resource. The schools really tried very hard with individual children. But we didn't have the multitude. We didn't have all the resources that there are today.
No, no. I've often wondered whether the number of troubled children that we have grows with the number of institutions that we provide, or which came first. You know?
Well, certainly we didn't know. For instance, we didn't even know about dyslexia in those days, so that you didn't know how to deal with that child. That child probably just tragically was never well, I know they were never diagnosed, and therefore they never got the treatment. Some of them, with a very specially wonderful school teacher, perhaps made the grade slowly. I think, of course, society did become much more complex. There were many more pressures on families. And so, and I think that resulted in more children showing disturbed behavior. And as you got family life becoming less secure, that helped to create more troubled children. So I think it's a combination that there are more troubled children, but more troubled children are diagnosed too. More children tended to not come to the attention. Parents struggled along very often on their own, and because there really weren't that many resources.
Again, still staying with that time period, what other providers of services to children would there have been? You'd mentioned the growing child guidance clinic and yourself. What else existed in Western
Very
Manitoba?
little. The Y within the city of Brandon. But, you know, community groups out in the area, but very little in the way of resources. Very few hospitals, even in the rural areas in those days. Long distances for many, many people to a doctor, to a dentist, to a lawyer. Mind you, unfortunately, for a lot of rural people, it's still true. The doctors tend to, you've got far more doctors than you need in the city of Winnipeg. And there are many places in rural Manitoba who don't have adequate medical services or dental services.
I see. What about funding? In 1948, the late 40s, how did the society get the money?
Well, we had a small community chest in the city of Brandon, and I can remember that we got, I think it was approximately $4,000 from that, which was quite a lot in those days. In the areas outside of Brandon, we had women's institutes and church groups who would send us money. They would make layettes for us so that we didn't have to buy clothing for the babies. They would send in quilts, you know, to help with the babies. We'd get gifts, in other words, of that kind. We would have communities. For instance, there's a wonderful community in southwestern Manitoba, Hamiota, a small town about 60 miles northwest of Brandon, where since about, well, before 1900, we're sponsoring a community program on behalf of the Children's Aid. It was usually an auction sale, and people would come and give their produce, bake their cakes, and then they'd go back and buy them back. Now, that still happens. That has been going on every year since then. And I was out there this last December again. And you know, you can pay $15 for a cake, $3 for an ordinary loaf of bread, and all the money goes to the Children's Aid. And now that is the biggest project of its kind. You know, that will bring in these days, because they also have a concert on Friday night, it'll bring in $2,000. But it has been going on in its own way for many, many years. So communities, and that helped both to, because we would go out and speak to all those groups. We spent a lot of time going out and telling people our story, because we always felt, I enjoyed doing that, although I must say that when they said they wanted me to take over as director of the Children's Aid Society, I said, oh, I can't speak in public. that's not possible. But I found that when you have a story to tell that is more important than you are, you soon find that in telling the story, you get so involved in the story that you find it's not so bad after all. And when people start responding, it really was very satisfying.
What was the role of the board of directors of the society at that time?
Well, it was a role whereby they hired the executive director, and they were an advisory board, a policy-making board, well, I've always felt that the board of directors in a private agency or in any group is just a tremendous resource of information and knowledge. It was what enabled us in southwestern Manitoba to really keep close and to look ahead, because I have a very strong feeling if you're not planning ahead, you're going backwards. And so we were constantly planning ahead, both board and staff. And we could do that in our staff meetings and in our board meetings. And we would try to deal every board meeting with an aspect of the program so that the board would get to be quite aware. They didn't make case decisions. They were a policy board, they were an advisory board, but my goodness, over the years, the real input that they had into that agency is tremendous.
Who dealt with the provincial government?
Well, the executive director and the board of directors. We used to, well, of course, it was not only provincial in those days, it was municipal, because all the ward funds came from the municipalities. So you had to go out and substantiate to the municipalities your rate. Of course, in those days, it was very little. What you paid for board and room, $20, $25, $30, a month. But still, in the budgets that they had in those days, that was still a sizable sum. And so you were having to do this. We always met with the Union of Manitoba Municipalities, of course. And I can remember us going out and meeting in Minnedosa with a group of municipalities and presenting our case for an increase in our rate. It wasn't until the late 50s, early 60s, I can't be exactly sure of the date, that ward maintenance costs were taken over by the provincial government totally.
So let me see if I understand the situation right then. You had a mandate from provincial legislation for apprehension of children. You would take a child into care at a rate determined and be paid a rate determined by the municipalities, and they would be required to pay that.
That's right. Yes.
And you were under the guidance of an independent board of directors.
Yes.
It's
yes.
an interesting situation of
Very.
Independence.
Yes. And of course, in those days, there was no money for a child after they were 16. And yet the age of our responsibility was 21 in those days. And it meant that many children didn't get the education, that they should have had, because the funds just ran out. And they would either have to go to work or work in a home. One of the young girls who had considerable potential, above average, when the maintenance ran out when she was 16, I took her home and she lived with me for 4 years and got her university education and is still teaching school, by the way. Getting reasonably close to retirement. Not there yet, but...
that brings me to another question about the situation of the children that were taken into care. Were they required by provincial law to attend school then, and did they do so until they were 16?
That was certainly one of our major responsibilities, to see that children got to school. And of course, a good number of children, if they had any special needs in education, we would try to place in the city of Brandon, because the Brandon school system, of course, had more facilities than the smaller schools. But you know, a lot of very good things happened in those one-room rural schools in the country, or in the town schools. There was they couldn't offer, naturally, and that's why consolidated schools came in. They couldn't offer the individual attention. But it's amazing how many extremely fine and independent working students came out of those small schools. It did mean a lot of children didn't get past public school, of course, if their family couldn't afford to send them on, you know, to board in town.
Yes. I wanted to ask you one final question to conclude on the situation in child welfare in the late 40s. In 1948 and 49, Charlotte Whitten did two reports on child welfare, one on child welfare in Alberta and one on child welfare in New Brunswick. Did her reports and the ensuing discussion of those reports have any effect on what you were doing in Manitoba?
Yes, I must say that we thought we were way ahead of those other areas, you know. Imagine them doing, you know, the situation being like that in Alberta. I can remember that we were very familiar with those reports. And yes, she was, she had a lot of influence in those days, and she was a very interesting, fascinating person, Charlotte Whitten.
Did you meet her?
Yes.
Well, can you recount for me some of those experiences?
No, not, I don't think I can. I just know that she was a vibrant personality, a very definite person, the kind of person, and of course completely unique for a woman to take that kind of leadership, strong role in those days. And we admired her, liked her, and certainly listened to what she had to say.
Do you think that the reports that she did had made things easier for you in Manitoba to accomplish the things that you wanted to, or did they have an effect there?
I think so. I think anything that pointed out the needs of children and families helped.
Interesting. Okay, I wonder if we might stop there for a few minutes and take a little break.
Okay.
What do you think?
Fine.
Can we stop, Greg? We're continuing on this morning the interview with Mrs. Helen Riesberry, and we've been talking about the situation of child welfare in Western Manitoba in the late 1940s. Before we continue on with your career at the Children's Aid Society in Western Manitoba, I wonder if we might refer back for just a moment to one of your early experiences at the hospital. I've forgotten the title of the hospital there.
Well, it was called the Brandon Mental Hospital in those days. It's the Brandon Mental Health Center now. Well, I worked there on the switchboard as a stenographer in the occupation department doing the ordering and so on. And, but I think one of the most memorable experiences was as a stenographer with D.U. and Cameron being the psychiatrist. And his name's been in the news recently, of course, because of the Allen Memorial Institute. But he was an outstanding person in the field. And I was just 16 when I went there to work, and as naive as could be. And he always jokingly said that I went around for the first 6 months with my mouth literally open because he took it upon himself to educate me. But he was very good. He would dictate the histories and explain to me what was meant. And, you know, that kind of information, all the things that I did before I actually went into social work were very, very helpful when I became a director of an agency and had that background knowledge, being able to type and do shorthand and operate a switchboard. I had a greater empathy with our clerical and accounting staff because I knew what they were doing. And
Indeed, and your contact with Dr. Cameron then, at the age of 16, that made an impression on you? That's,
Certainly did.
that's lasted for a while.
He was also, you know, a really top-notch tennis player. And he used to get cross at me because he would say, you know, you've got the build. I was tall and slim. He said, you've got the stroke. You're just lazy.
So you didn't take him up on offers to
Well, I actually, at one time in my life, was in a doubles tournament at Clear Lake, was runner-up, mainly because my partner was better than I was.
That's marvelous. Also, during your education at the University of Manitoba, there were some other memorable people whose memory or whose...
Well, Helen Mann is the outstanding person, and of course for many years, because she took over as director of the school, and she had so much. I think anyone who went through the Manitoba school, she was a beautiful woman. We used to just like to look at her, and those days women wore hats, and she used to have the most fascinating hats.
Yes.
And she was a very memorable person. I think too, yeah, and of course, hopefully you'll be interviewing her, and you're going to miss some of the outstanding people, because the K.O. McKenzie, when K.O. McKenzie was Director of Welfare for the province of Manitoba, and Sid McCartan was Assistant Director, they were just a marvelous team, because K.O. was a wonderful administrator, was a social worker, so he had the practical background, had been director at Western. Sid McCartan was an idea person, very sensitive. They made a wonderful team. They worked together wonderfully. And I often, you know, these days, often appointments are made where there isn't a social work background. And I often get concerned that the profession, which has a real body of knowledge and some real skills, I become concerned when those people aren't more in the planning, you know, in the administrative aspects of the field.
You're feeling then that there's something special that social workers can bring to planning and administration?
Yes. Mind you, I think one of the problems is that sometimes if you've gone straight through a university stream without getting the administrative aspects to go along with it, it does make it rather difficult. And so I can see that sometimes an administrative person is brought in. But if they don't have a real grounding in social work, they're missing something that's very important in that whole field.
Indeed. In your training at the School of Social Work, did you have any formal training in administration?
I was very fortunate because we knew by Christmas that I was going back to the agency. And the school was marvelous. They gave me a special placement for the whole of the rest of the year at the YWCA with one of the top administrators. Oh, I know her name so well. Sometimes names go at this time. Philpott. Have
Florence
you ever?
Philpott?
Florence Philpott.
Yes.
Yes. And I did a special placement with her in administration, which, you know, was I thought that was tremendous of the school to do something like that.
Indeed. And how did you find Florence to work with?
Oh, excellent. I learned so much from her. And then I did my second placement with Marjorie Robbins at the Family Bureau. And, well, there's just, you know, in terms of working with families, she was just absolutely marvelous.
So you returned
Tremendous
to,
experience.
sorry. So you returned to the agency then when you finished school in 1948. You probably had had a chance to think about what was going to happen during your time, your term as executive director. Did you go into the job as executive director with specific goals?
No, I didn't. I didn't. I just knew that I wanted to bring the agency together to try to serve the people of Western Manitoba, but I really didn't have specific goals. They developed. There was so much to be done when I first went in terms of getting to know staff, getting to know programs, getting to know the whole area. And but always what we tried to do was to look ahead. And if there was one emphasis over the years that I think we did concentrate on, it was prevention. We always felt, mind you, we had hundreds of children in care over the years, but it was something that always concerned us, that we always wanted to build up, to provide supports for the child in their own homes so that they wouldn't have to leave their own homes. And so we embarked on a program of many children's aides only counseled if there was a complaint of neglect, you know, the basic protection service. We moved very rapidly to dealing with families who asked us for help because we felt that was one step ahead. And of course there was no family bureau in a small community like Brandon or in western Manitoba, so it was quite appropriate for us to do this. And likewise, as we saw the need for children to come into care, guardianship certainly is a protection for many children, but also we didn't feel it was right for many children. These parents were doing their best, but they ran into difficulties, illness, physical illness, mental illness, all kinds of situations where temporarily they couldn't care. So we moved very quickly into non-ward care, you know, taking children into care without a transfer of guardianship. And of course, for many, many years, there was no public money for that. That all came from our community chest and our fall campaign, these various groups in the community which supported us. But it was very important to us that we try to develop those kinds of services. We also went into homemaker service. We went into daycare, all under the same umbrella, all with this concept of preventing, and finally into family life education. And
is that something that is relatively unique?
I think so, for children's aid societies. We wanted to change our name to the Children's and Family Service way back in the 50s, but we were advised by the government, our good friend Sid McCartan, now we support you in the programs that you're giving, but you shouldn't change your name because that's the legislative name and it might affect grants. So we kept the name of the children. But I understand that the new legislation, which is coming in very soon, is going to actually change the name to a family and children's service rather than just, because that's where it is today, and that's what we were working towards over the years, is the family counseling and the support services for families to enable more parents to provide a healthy environment for their children.
During the years that you were at the Children's Aid Society, which I've forgotten now exactly how long.
48. Well, I was there, started in 45, came back as director in 48, and retired in 1976, October.
So during the 28 years as executive director,
That's right.
You must have seen a tremendous number of changes in clients' needs, services.
Every way. Well, there were, society changed markedly. You know, post-war, you had a fantastic change in the increase in urbanization, people leaving the farms. There were, you know, a quarter section at one time was adequate to keep a family. It was very soon that you needed a section, 360 acres. Of course, that is not in the new metric. And then even farms that were several sections. So you had an awful lot of young people moving into the cities. You had the increase in mobility, just as, goodness gracious, in the early days there was no flying, and you know, the old North Stars that used to shake you around, and then post-war, of course, mobility, and companies moved people all across, so that young couples would find themselves maybe 1,000 miles from their family supports. You know, at one time, if there was illness, they could call on grandmother or an aunt, but it got that often they were far removed from those people. And then, of course, during the war years, when women were needed in the workforce, a good number of them stayed on, and new ones joined it after the war. So you had a very different, you had a marked change in societal conditions. And so you needed more supports for families. Families needed more supports from the community because they had lost a lot of the old familial supports. And of course we learned more. And we learned more about how to help children and how to help families and to provide protection in its fullest meaning, not just taking a child out of the home because of neglect, but protecting children while they're in their own homes and finding substitute homes for them. Well, there's just so much we could deal with. The change in adoptions, for instance, over the years, which is absolutely fantastic. You know, in the early years, if you didn't have the history of both parents, you had to hold a child till they were 4 years of age and could be tested at the child guidance clinic to be determined that they were normal. Well, gradually, you know, we learned more about children and their development, and that gradually went down to 1 year. Then we placed children early, as soon as they were available, recognizing that people were prepared to take a chance. Not everybody. Some people wanted a child who was just a Anglo-Saxon background and blue eyes and blonde hair, but a lot of people you found were much more flexible than that. You went from periods when you had far more babies to a time when you didn't have enough babies. You know, the changes. I can remember the days when we had so many babies, the Winnipeg Children's Aid used to bring them out to Brandon in a station wagon. You know, because we had more resources. We had enough foster homes, and they didn't have enough in the city of Winnipeg. And well, in every service, of course, there were changes.
Excuse me, major changes. One of the other changes that came about over that period of time, I would think, would have been the awareness on the part of Native peoples of their own social welfare needs.
That's very...
You had some part in that too,
Yes.
I understand.
Well, we started in Western Manitoba providing service on a cooperative basis long before there was any agreement for us to provide services, basically. And this was because in Western Manitoba, there was the Manitoba Sanatorium at Ninette, and many of the people who came there were Native people, Indian and Eskimo, and a lot of little babies were born in the San. And of course, a TB San was no place for a baby. And so the doctor who was the head there, I know his name as well as can be, but it's gone for the moment. But he would always just phone and say, Helen, we have another baby. Can you look after the baby? And we would try to place that baby close by the sanatorium so that the foster parents could take the baby to visit with the mother. And then we would often make it possible for the mother to visit in that home for several days before they went back north with the baby. So we started doing it on that kind of a cooperative basis long before. There was the first agreement was in 1962, and at that time we were the only agency that went on to Indian reserves. I guess we were, maybe because we were in a rural area, I'm not sure, but we always had a little bit of that feeling that if you wait until everything's just right, you've got everything to go with. You may never go. That life isn't like that. You know, you have, so we agreed to take over services to people on Indian reserves in April 1962. And that opened a whole new area. I well remember when the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council was first initiated to provide a common voice for many of the Native people. And of course that is the group which now in Western Manitoba, you know, is handling their own child welfare services. And I was happy in my retirement to serve 3 years on the Tripartite committee that helped recommend and make that possible. Oh, there's been so much.
I'm looking forward to talking more about the Tripartite Agreement. How did the 1962 agreement come about?
Well, it was a recognition. Agencies had been saying for social workers concerned about Native children had been saying for a long time, it is not right that we should have people living in our areas who are not getting these child welfare services. We made petitions about it, and finally, this first agreement, I can remember going around to every one of the reserves before the agreement was entered into to meet the people, to talk with them, to tell them what it would be about. And I can remember going to one of the reserves in the north where the person who was driving me around, because the roads were atrocious on the reserves, you know, and he had one of these four-wheel drive vehicles, and he was going so carefully through the potholes, etc., and he said, you know, when the people come from Ottawa, I don't give them this gentle a ride. Because one of the problems was that Ottawa was so far away that a lot of the decisions that were made really weren't appropriate. And so we were very glad that a greater recognition was being made of the needs of Native people.
You must have had some special quality that you were able to negotiate these agreements, or this particular agreement.
Well, we didn't negotiate it directly. The agreement was actually between the federal government and the provincial government. We were the enablers. We were the ones who were offering the service, but it was pretty important that we met with the band councils and with the people on the reserves before we started, because they needed to know something about us.
Oh, indeed. And had they not felt that they could trust you and entrust you with their children?
And mind you, that only came very slowly. And I wouldn't ever say that it became complete. That's why the Native people have been anxious to take over, you know, services themselves. And I have certainly been supportive of that. I hope someday we'll all be back together again. But I really felt that this was important in the interim, because we found, as we offered services on the reserves, that the only way it was really effective was if we had an Indigenous person. And that was such a struggle, trying to get Ottawa to accept that that was important.
In what role would that
Well, that person would be a person who lived on the reserve, who would work in cooperation with the trained worker from the agency, the professional person from the agency. But that person knew far more about family. For instance, if you were looking for a foster home for an Indian child, that person knew about the interrelationships and where there might be a home on the reserve. Because, of course, when we started, there were no foster homes on reserves. We never had as many as we would like, but we did get to the point where 1 in every 4 children was in a foster home on an Indian reserve. So we were making progress. Not fast enough probably for the Indian people, but there was a great deal of thought put into it and a great deal of work done. And certainly having a person from the reserve working with us was the only way that that we could really get to know and to be more sensitive to the people on the reserve.
Given the discussion over the past couple of years about the placement of Native children, I feel that I must ask about the 3 out of the 4 Native children who are not on in foster homes on reserves. Where did those children go?
Well, they went to non-Native homes, primarily in Canada, primarily in Manitoba, secondly in Canada, and if not there, in the United States. And one of the difficulties was, and you know, one of the tragedies really is that you see only that southern little piece of Manitoba was served by children's aid societies. North of that, there was still no service unless it was life and death and most of the reserves are up there in the north. And there were resources there that there was no one to develop or tap. That was one of our major concerns in Tripartite, which we may get to, was that this service be all over the province of Manitoba. So there were resources out there that we couldn't get to or know about. We tried. I know that it wasn't as much as the Native people would have liked. But as an agency, we really did struggle with this, and we really did. If there was an Indian home, that home certainly was given every opportunity. And we made very different kinds of regulations with respect to a foster home on a reserve and a foster home in the city of Brandon, you know, where there were health department regulations which were very strict about the number of cubic feet of airspace, etc. Well, that kind of thing we didn't even consider in an Indian home. We were looking for people who could provide loving care to a child. And that was the most important thing.
So then one of the possible solutions, which for some reason it wasn't able to tap, was that for the reserves that were in the north, there too were potential foster homes.
Oh, of course, that's what I'm saying.
But there was no way to develop them.
There was no way to develop them. There was no, just now we're really getting into, now before I left, we were making, fortunately, there was one provincial government social worker who did a super job of developing homes in Red Sucker Lake and up in that area, and we were able to place a good number of children up there through his efforts. And but that was just a beginning, you know.
Yeah, indeed.
It wasn't so. It wasn't the lack of concern and the lack of understanding as much as it was the lack of resources to develop often. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't in many areas, perhaps not an appropriate understanding of the native culture too.
The tripartite agreement is a move towards solving some of those problems. So what was your involvement? What is it, and what was your involvement?
Well, it was after I retired, and the government, the provincial government, asked me if I would be one of their representatives on this tripartite, which was fascinating experience. We worked for 3 years, and it was the provincial government, the federal government, and the native people themselves. And we made a rule as we started out that unless all 3 parties were there, we would not meet. We were not going to make any decisions without all 3 parties being there. We had some real struggles. We did an awful lot of learning, all of us. And when we completed our report, we thought, well, it might be another of these that sits on a shelf somewhere, you know, and never comes to light. But actually, they were kind enough to say that this was a blueprint for Canada. And, you know, we had a big ceremony when the report was accepted and presented, and a good deal of it has been implemented.
What was special about that report?
Well, what was special about it was certainly the fact that we were saying very strongly that the native people must have a share in the planning right from the beginning, you know, in the planning of services, the delivery of services for their people. And
the report and its implementation, did it result in a change in mandate for child welfare services?
Well, yes, because the Dakota Ojibwe Tribal Council now has the mandate, you see, to provide services. They took over, now this was since I left the agency, but they have now taken over the child, because of course Tripartite was after I left the agency as director. They are now providing child welfare services, and just very recently they took over the adoption service too. They said they weren't ready to do that initially, and but I believe it's in this last year that was also taken over.
So there's definitely a move toward a solution of the issues regarding Native children and children's aid societies.
I think so. I think Manitoba has moved farther than many other provinces. In the course of our study, we went to reserves in the United States and you know, looked at what they have done and how the services have developed. We went to Alberta to the Blackfoot Reserve. Fascinating experience. And so we tried. We got a lot of material, and we really tried to look at all aspects.
Returning now to your experience as executive director at the CAS, did you see a change? What changes did you see in staffing, the size of the agency, caseloads, funding, and that
Just
sort of thing?
fantastic. You know, when we started, we had 5 staff members and 2 clerical staff. When I left, we had 32 on the social work staff. I think it was 32. It could have been 31 or 33. And including clerical staff and house parent staff, because by then we had 6 group homes of our own and a New Maples, and we had a staff of 80, over 80 or more. And our budgets, of course, went from, you know, I'm not sure whether it was 35 or 45,000 to begin with, to $1.5 million. You know, it's, and of course, what went into that was, well, the whole society, of course, there was inflation. Not as rapid as it's been in recent years, but there was an inflationary process all the way along. Just the same as when I started, I was earning $2,700 a year, and when I left, I was earning about $24,000, and that's over a 28-year period. Now, I don't suppose there's an executive director who anywhere who's getting as little as $24,000 these days. But
Yeah,
so
continues to change.
it's and of course gradually too the province took over much more responsibility for funding. That was another of the changes. And the federal government, of course, federal money came in as services to Native people were involved. So you had a tremendous escalation in your service clientele, because as you get into preventive programs, of course, rather than just neglect situations, you get a much larger share of your community. When you get homemaker service, that doesn't relate to any one area of your community. When you get family counseling, it happens in all strata of your community. When you get daycare, so that your population becomes much larger at the same time that your economy is escalating. So that tremendous growth.
During the period of time that you were executive director, to my knowledge, 2 significant pieces of legislation were implemented, and I don't know what impact they had on you and your agency. One was the Social Assistance Act in 1958, and the second was the Canada Assistance Plan, the federal act.
Well, of course, they affected us a great deal because, first of all, we moved from municipal to financial welfare assistance rates, which gave people a base, so that once that came in, you really didn't expect to have to apprehend it. That was our whole presentation. You should never have to take a child from their own home because they don't have the necessities of life. And so that was one great step forward. Then as federal financing came in to help the province, it meant that the province could provide more money, particularly in a province like Manitoba, which was not a wealthy province.
Excuse me, Ms. Riesberry, I wonder if we might stop for a minute. And to resume our discussion then, we were talking about some of the changes that you saw during your years at the Children's Aid Society. I'd like to ask you a couple of other questions about changes, and then maybe we could discuss some of the services in a little more detail. During the time you were at the agency, was unionization an issue?
Never.
Your staff was not unionized?
No. For which I'm grateful.
Why is that?
Well, I guess maybe I'm getting very old, because I think unions were very essential in many aspects of society. But I guess I've never seen a union and professions as being together. I've always seen a professional person as accepting the responsibility for a job and doing it to the very best of their ability without extra pay for overtime, extra pay for, you know, I guess it's just, and I'm sure it works very well at times, but in a smaller agency, perhaps it's easier. Perhaps you can keep communication channels open more readily. We were always able to meet as a total staff, even as we got larger, for staff conferences every week. You know, my office door was always open. That's why I sometimes found myself, most of the time, working very long hours. But then for me, it was not just a job. It was my life. I loved it. No, we didn't have a union.
Didn't have a union. Also during that period of time, and there continues to be a move toward credentialism, professionalizing of the social work community itself. Did you see that kind of move reflected in your agency?
Well, do you mean in terms of staffing?
Mm-hmm.
You see, when I started out as director, there were 5 of us, and we were all graduates.
Mm-hmm.
But then social work experienced a fantastic growth after the war. You know, when the war services ended, then there was more money, there were more people, there were more needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so social work grew. Well, as our staff grew, we couldn't get enough trained people. So we were bringing people on with their BA, with emphasis in the social sciences, and working with them on an in-training basis. Either we would do it provincially, we sometimes did it cooperatively. We always saw that they had intensive supervision as they worked ahead. And then we would encourage them to come into the School of Social Work, give them leave of absence, you know, to get their training and come back to us. And so we went through, so we did move from total professional staff to a lot of people coming. And I always felt that having started that way myself, perhaps it made me somewhat more sensitive and able to know what they needed to be, to know.
Sure.
And because we couldn't have functioned at all without those people.
Yeah.
It's now back, of course, to where there are enough trained people. For they did bring in the welfare services course in Manitoba when we were so desperately short. And there were courses in both Brandon and Winnipeg of welfare services, which was a year for hopefully fairly mature people who maybe had worked in the field or who had done volunteer work or other services and went in and took a year's course and then came back to the agency, not as fully professional people, but certainly with a fairly good grounding. And I know that we had people in Brandon who had worked with us as volunteers, and we had said to them, if you go and take that course, we'll hire you. Because we knew they had the personal skills. And so there were a lot of people who came to agencies that way. In terms of professionalization, I guess one of the things I'm concerned about, I've always been a member of MASW. I was proud to be a member of MASW. And I've always been disappointed that 100% of social workers didn't feel that it was important to belong and to support their professional organization.
Were you involved in the work of the Professional Association over the years?
Yes, oh yes. I've held various positions and been their representative, for instance, on School of Social Work Admissions Committee. I served on their task force. Again, that was after my retirement. We had a task force here when the first really drastic restraint program came in. I was a member of that task force. And so yes, and I've served with MIRSW. That's our Manitoba Institute of Registered Social Workers. This was your, if you like, your self-disciplining group, where as a member you subjected yourself to the discipline of the organization. And I worked on discipline committees and, you know, various aspects. Yes, I've generally been fairly active in the field.
During that time of your involvement with MASW, it was threatened that the School of Social Work be closed.
Oh, I remember that.
What happened then?
We used to drive in from Brandon with 1 or 2 carloads of people to join in the representation of the great need for the School of Social Work. And I remember we had a wonderful party when they finally decided that the School of Social Work was needed and would continue. You wouldn't ever know Mary Liz Bear, but you are interviewing Anne Dumoulin,
yes.
I believe.
Yes.
Well, Anne and Mary Liz Bear were very great friends. And Mary Liz was, she wrote the most beautiful poem. I remember about this, the saving of the School of Social Work. No, it was quite a dramatic time because you see, social work education has always been very costly because of the need for the field training. Certain disciplines are more costly than where you can put many, many students with one lecturer. And so yes, we almost lost the School of Social Work, but we all rallied round and, and we were very happy.
Yes.
When it was saved.
Saved, yes, yes. I do want to return to again, your work at the Children's Aid Society, and I'm conscious of the fact that we're weaving in and out here, but I like to think of us as the two of us putting together a tapestry, perhaps.
It's a mosaic.
Indeed.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, one's career is a mosaic, isn't
Yes.
it?
Yes.
You offered some somewhat unique services from your agency, maybe particularly in the prevention area. Would you like to describe some of those?
Yes, we did. I think we tried to we did combine both the typical Children's Aid Society and the Family Bureau kind of aspect under one roof. And for instance, we started day foster care because we could see the need in our own community long before there was any thought of provincial programs. We started our day foster care program back in 1967, and we had over 200 children in day foster care, supervised, where we approved the homes and supervised the placements. And the parents, or our funding, our private funding, made it possible. We had a preschool enrichment course. It started, first of all, well, children in protection families, where there was a real bond between the parents and children, but where perhaps because there were too many children, because they were limited resources, because they were native people who'd come into the city and were having difficulty, we said, maybe if we can enrich the experience of these children. It was a little bit like a Head Start program. And we started, the first was just tentative steps. You've got to crawl before you can walk and run. We had a foster mother who took half a dozen of these children into her own home. Then we set aside a room at the Maples where we could have these children in. And we'd bring them in. We'd have to pick them up. These parents generally didn't have transportation. And we would bring them in, and it was all volunteers at that time because there was very little funding. You know, we'd get the money from our private funds for the equipment. But it was volunteers who would come and spend time with the children, talking with them, reading to them, teaching them simple crafts, etc. And enrichment, just to help develop their verbal skills. And because tragically so many children would start out school as losers. And we were hoping, I think one of the many good things happen to you in social work. You know, you see more problems probably in a week than most people see in a year, but you also see the wonderful responses, the small miracles that happen as children blossom, as foster parents are able to have a child recover from a desperate situation. And I'll never forget this one mother who, after our preschool had been going for some time, and her third child was into it, and she was saying, you know, this child, the teacher says she's right up, you know, that she's able to do the things with the other children, and it was all because of this start that she got. And this kind of these and the program, of course, did develop. Once there was provincial funding came in, as daycare became a provincial program, then we could set it up, and it ran all day, 5 days a week, with one group of children coming in the morning and the other group coming in the afternoon. And then we said, well, now, you know, but these parents, it's not enough to just deal with the children. So we started having parent groups of the parents of these children. First of all, just for socialization, because many of them didn't have much of a social life. And they faced a lot of problems. But it was amazing how those people came along. We called it, first of all, our mother's group. And we would have babysitters to look after their other children, and the parents would have a social time, and then one of us or somebody from the community would go to talk to them about some aspect. And then we had groups for children, for our young people, because we said, well, there's no point saying to a child, you mustn't do that, without giving them some better alternatives. So we would have groups for our teenagers, focused perhaps around a sewing project or a cooking project, but where they'd also learn about grooming, where they'd also learn about nutrition and menus. And you know, the number of volunteers, well, we had more volunteers than staff most of the time. And it was these kinds of programs that we developed with with children and parents. And then we got to the point where we actually hired, we worked this all out with staff and board, a family life ed person. There was a lot of controversy in this part of the world about family life education and the negative aspects of it. Well, people were very concerned that it was primarily sexually oriented, of course, and there was a lot of protest in the schools and in the community generally. But what we wanted to do, family life education to us was much, much broader. And we brought a person on staff who not only served within the city of Brandon with groups of this kind, but who could also go out into the rural areas, all with the idea of helping families themselves to provide a more positive environment for their children.
One of the family life education and the whole area of prevention generally has sometimes been a difficulty in other provinces and in other services as far as getting funding for it. Did you find that that was the case here?
Well, yes, of course, but again, I think we were prepared to take a risk. For instance, we opened a daycare center, the Children's Aid did, with the help of the community, before there was any program provincially for funding for such centers. And I remember we were very proud that we were able to do that without any provincial funding involved. But many groups, I remember the people at the university were very, and the staff contributed $500, and the students contributed $500, and the city contributed $2,000. This meant a lot of working, because City Council, when it was first suggested, were against it. But I think we always tried not the confrontational approach, but the working together approach. That often people were against something because they didn't know enough about it, and that they needed to have an opportunity to sit down and talk with you. We did this with the daycare situation, and it changed from City Council being against it to giving us several $1,000s to make it possible. The same thing worked with housing. We were in desperate, we could see family after family in trouble because there was no adequate housing. That was before subsidized housing came to be a fact. And a group of the agencies, with the Children's Aid taking a very strong role, did a survey, and bless the Canadian Welfare Council, with which you are now, they wanted to do a cross-Canada survey, so they let us be the pilot project. We'd written to them to get some, so they used a computer, I guess one of the first that was to help us correlate our results. And as a result of that study, and we went with a great big delegation to City Council, you know, and made presentations. And of course, in social work, we knew all about Regents Park in Toronto and other housing areas. And of course, we learned Regents Park was hailed. I can remember when Professor Rose in Toronto, when that was developed, and this was going to solve all the problems. And of course, it created as many as it solved. So our whole emphasis was on scattered site housing. No great blocks of public housing. So in Brandon, the housing is scattered throughout the city, and you can drive around, and it's just incredible how well most of that housing is maintained.
And this was something that came about through your work at the Children's Aid Society?
Yes, it was all because we saw ourselves as broader than just the Children's Aid. You know, we worked collaboratively, cooperatively with other agencies through what we called the Community Services Council. And we would meet once a month, and we would look at needs, and then we would look at how it could be met. And we did some pretty exciting things. I'm very sorry there is no Community Services Council in Brandon now.
It doesn't exist?
It doesn't exist anymore.
Why did it go out of business?
I guess the agencies didn't support it. They somehow felt they were too busy doing other things. And yet we always felt that it was so important to work with others.
To move now to some more general questions, during the period that you were at the CAS, what do you remember as the major challenges that you had to deal with as executive director of that agency?
Well, the constant challenge was always to try to see what the needs were, and with your board and your staff to be planning ahead to try to meet those needs. Because they're constantly changing. That's the only thing that was constant, was change.
Yes.
And trying to be one step ahead. Just took all your, that's how we went into developing group homes, to day foster care, daycare center, groups for families. That was all like an ongoing process.
So the need to plan ahead then was something, what, were there forces or events that made that a very difficult thing to do, to plan ahead?
Well, I think often there was lack of funding, so that you were certainly concerned about that. Sometimes you were running into opposition, but again, we tried to deal with that by working together to show what the need was and the advantages in meeting that need for the whole community, not just for the, you know, if you have families with inadequate housing, those particular families are most affected. The whole community is affected too. And so that we always tried to show that this was good to make our community totally a better place. And I always found that there were always challenges ahead, because people used to say, well, don't you get into a rut staying in the same place so many years? And I said, no, never found it that way. There was always something new that needed to be done.
Never did. Perhaps I could ask a question or two about what's happening now, today in Winnipeg. I understand that the Manitoba government has become strongly involved in the structure and management of the Winnipeg Children's Aid Society. Is that something that one might have foreseen?
Winnipeg Children's Aid has had one of the most difficult tasks that any agency could ever be asked to do. So that, you know, it's, and all along they have had some considerable problems. They've also, on a day-to-day basis, done some very, very fine work. We used to work with them, of course, very closely, but they have had difficulty in keeping communication, in working with the Indigenous peoples, with the Native peoples. They have had a huge agency, so there have been problems. I guess, though, I was very concerned about the solution, and primarily about the process of the solution, to set aside a board of directors, properly, you know, constituted, and to replace them with 5 government appointees. And to do that almost in a vacuum without there having been any real structure for what was going to be brought in. I guess, I agree, I read the MASW brief to the government, and I agreed with their concerns. And they recognized that there were problems that needed to be dealt with, but I think we probably looked at solutions as being somewhat different.
One of the questions that continually comes up regarding children's aid societies is one that I'm sure you've had to deal with a number of times during your career. I wonder if you'd be willing to share your views on whether or not children's aid societies should continue to have legislative responsibility for child welfare, and why.
Well, of course, I'm biased. You know, I spent most of my life working within a private agency setting, and I certainly feel very strongly that a private agency is more closely related to the community it serves than many public agencies. I think it's sad, you know, that that is so, but you see, the general community doesn't leave money to the government. They don't provide in their will to give the government money. Whereas many, many people left money to the Children's Aid Society. It was those dollars that enabled us to be innovative, you know, to establish programs. And I think that is one of the major roles of a private agency, is to innovate, to demonstrate, to determine the need, and then to try to find ways of meeting it. And I think they're in a much better position to do this than a government agency. Partly because even though the majority of dollars are government, those private dollars make possible a great deal more than you would think possible, you know, when you compare the number of private dollars in a budget to the government dollars. And I know from our own experience how many things we were able to do with that kind of support. And with the support, the city isn't going to give money to establish a program that is under government legislation. But with the Children's Aid Society, we had a lot of help from the city of Brandon. We had a lot of help from service clubs. Well, our two first group homes, called Kinsman House and Kinnett House, because the Kinsman clubs provided the funding. Now, they wouldn't do that for the government. You know, I think that, and of course I feel that the board of directors, I'm very convinced out of my own experience of the value of having those people working along. And I guess I'm a little concerned about the growing emphasis of political appointments on boards of directors. And the numbers, we're in trouble at Brandon University, you know, and there are many, well, we won't get into that. But I guess I'm very concerned of anything that indicates sort of a politicizing of social services, universities, etc. I know there's a lot of public money in, and you have to be accountable. I think accountability is very important. But I really feel that there are things like that it becomes very serious if it means that you're going to lose a lot of staff every time government changes, and you know, that these services really need to be ongoing services.
There are two senses in which the word politicization can be used. One is in terms of a given political party, and the other is in terms of working in and through the political system to accomplish social change. Do you see that?
And that latter is important. A private agency has to do that too. Well, all our representations as private agencies working together for extension of service to Native peoples, for changing from municipal to provincial funding, changing child welfare acts to bring them more up to date. Yes, you can't work without government, but that's very different, I think, to it becoming so that, because I think, of course, government's changing. I'm getting older, you know, but I do get a little concerned about confrontation being so much a part that it's, if it isn't your party's platform, it couldn't be right. And there's very little mutual support, you know, for what's the best for the country, what's best for people. You know, we used to take all our own cases into court for many years. I used to, at the School of Social Work, we took courses in legal aspects from a wonderful lawyer, Mildred Murray. And so for many, many years, I took all the cases into court on behalf of the Children's Aid Society. And when we started having to use lawyers all the time, you found that you were getting much more this confrontational. Now, I believe in people having the right to representation, you know, and sides being presented. It's not that. But this whole aspect of confrontation has become so paramount, it seems to me.
Sorry, I'm losing my voice again. Just a few questions as we move toward the end of my questions. Anyway, you may have some comments at the end that you'd care to make. As you look back on your career, what would you say are the most significant developments that have happened in child welfare?
Well, that's, well, certainly the emphasis on the real importance of the relationship between parents and child, and that you save that whenever you can. I think all the programs that help to support families, to keep them together. And yet, you know, our society's at the point where more families are breaking up than ever before. And that just brings more needs as new families are, you know, the current divorce rate and the breakup of families. And so you need that much more in terms of your philosophy remains the same, that these relationships are important, but society makes it more and more difficult for you sometimes to see that children's needs in that regard are fulfilled.
And then would that affect the services that agencies would need to provide because of the recognition of that bond?
Of course, there are more people coming to you, hurting people, because you can't have separations and divorces without people being hurt, even when they're amicable. You know, the relationships are there's a great deal of depth to them, and there's an awful lot of hurt. And so I think that dealing with children and then reconstituted families, with putting families together, I think that we still have a long way to go in really meeting children's needs in our society.
What
we really aren't a child-oriented society. We talk about it, but I don't think we really are.
What remains to be done in your mind in child welfare in Manitoba?
Well, I'm a little removed from it, you know, at the present time, but I think it's basically this, to try to provide a healthy, growing environment for children so that they can develop their potential. They're our only tomorrow. And so I really do feel that we have given children so much in material things. Our children have far more than they need in material things. But I'm not sure that we haven't shortchanged them in values and in terms of relationships and security of relationships.
Who do you think should take the major role in bringing that change about?
Well, I think that it's, again, no one person, no one agency, no one group. It's something that, and society is really, I think, struggling with all of these things. It's just that change is so rapid and needs develop so fast that you're always struggling just to catch, to be on top, and you don't quite make it.
During your career, you've done many things. Could you have you made a judgment as to what, in your mind, are your most significant achievements during that career?
I think, as one person in a whole spectrum of people at CAS Western, that we were able to help many, many children. And that was always satisfying, to see children blossom, to see families reunited, to see relationships healed. So I do think that's important. I think also that in social work you do learn skills which you as an individual can use in your community. I've always been, that was one of the reasons I retired at 60 instead of 65, and life has been very exciting since then in terms of areas where those skills can be used in the community. So I think anybody in social work, you know, really should be very grateful for the kind of training that they have. And you know, some people say, oh, retirement's so boring, you know, I haven't any life left. And because the agency was so much my life, I think I wondered occasionally if that would happen, although not really, because I knew there were so many things I wanted to do. But it's just been all kinds of opportunities, just new doors opening every time, more than you can answer.
Is there anything that you'd change if you had it to do over again about your career?
I don't think so, because if I'd done something different, I'd have missed doing something that I did do. You know, I think that's true of life. You know, people say, oh, I wish I could do so-and-so. But we only have 24 hours in a day, any of us. And if we didn't do some of the things we did, if we did something else, then what would we have left out that we did do? I've never regretted that I stayed in Brandon. And continued to serve that community. It worked for me. It wouldn't for a lot of other people, you know, but then we're all individuals. And so I'm not saying at all that the way we did it was right. I know it worked for us.
Any advice that you'd give to people who are currently practicing social work, or to students who...
Oh, dear, that's a presumptuous thing to even suggest. No, I think that, you know, when we first went through the School of Social Work, of course, it was in the days when, you know, you were taught that you wouldn't ever accept anything from a client. You know, that, after all, that would destroy the professional relationship. But then we learned, and I was always convinced of that, that people like to give as well as be given to. And if they want to give you a bunch of carrots or some flowers, I would certainly be against large gifts or anything. But it doesn't affect your service. It never should. That's your responsibility. But, you know, a relationship is a two-way relationship. It's not just one. So I think the caring, sometimes you can be maybe too professional. You know, that common sense, intuition, these are factors that are also play a part in your life of service. Mostly caring about others. And then people in different ways, from very different backgrounds, can do, I have seen people from tremendously different backgrounds do wonderful work with others. So there isn't just one way. You know, I say it would be presumptuous of me to say this is the way you should do it. You have to find within the skills that you learn. I think there are people who basically have some of those skills in their own personality, and that training hones those skills and gives them a greater body of knowledge to use. And I think that's important. But I know in our agency, people were able to, and one of the things you have to try to do as director of an agency is to get people working in areas where their particular skills are best used.
Which could certainly be a challenge from time to time.
Yes, it is. And it gets more difficult the larger the agency.
I'm sure.
I was always glad that I was in a smaller agency where I knew all of my staff intimately. You know, I knew every child in the care of the agency. You know, that's very different when, that's been one of Winnipeg's difficulties, and perhaps, I'm not sure that splitting it into 5 is going to necessarily solve that. It will solve some of the problems, but I think there are also other ways of doing it. But you do have to be able to get that communication and understanding.
In closing now, I wonder if there are any parting words that you'd like to leave us with, things that you'd like to share with us that haven't come out so far.
Well, we've ranged far and wide. I don't have any special words of wisdom to offer. I just know that social work was, for me, a very exciting experience. It was always something new. You saw the heartaches, but you also saw the joys. So that it's a wonderful profession to be a part of. I hope that more and more will support the professional association. If they don't voluntarily, I would like to see it become mandatory under legislation, because I do feel we need a strong professional association. I think that's important.
Okay. Well, in conclusion then, Mrs. Riesberry, I want to thank you very much for sharing your time, your experience, your recollections with us. I've certainly enjoyed talking with you and hearing about child welfare in Manitoba and the many other experiences that you've had. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, it's been sort of fun.
Good.
It's brought back all kinds of memories, things that I really haven't thought about for a long, long time. And I'll go home, I know, and think about all kinds of things. I should have told her this. But
thanks
thank
again.
you, and all the best to you
Thanks very
in your
much.
interviews.